Hello everyone, welcome to Alexandra Library for this very exciting event today. My name is Kayo Denda and I am the head of the Marjorie Summers Foster Center and Women's Studies Librarian here at the libraries. And my great pleasure today is to welcome our author and my great colleague, Janet Brennan. This event today is in partnership with the Office of Summer and Winter Sessions here at the university. So today we'll hear from Janet, our head of access and delivery services at the libraries. She previously held the same position at the University of Oklahoma, where she was also an associate professor. Janet is the author of War and the Works of J.R.R. Tolkien, winner of the Mythopoeic Society Award for Inkling Studies, and several book chapters on the Peter Jackson films. And she has published articles on Tolkien, J.R.R. Rowling, Terry Pratchett, Joss Whedon, and other authors and topics in journals such as Mythlore, Malern, Tolkien Studies, Slayage, and Seven. And she's editor and co-editor of 7 collections of essays on Tolkien, Louis McMaster Bujold, T.A. Shippey, C.S. Lewis, and other authors. She edits the referee journal titled Mythlore, for which she compiled a book-length annotated index, and serves on the board of the Mythopoeic Press, for which she has indexed and annotated several titles. So today's talk, which is based on this book here, you see piles here and also outside, Women in the Works and Life of J.R.R. Tolkien, is actually the topic of today's talk, has been described as an invaluable book that should put to rest persistent cliches about women in Tolkien's work and life, and, quote, remarkable for demonstrating the ongoing vigor in this vein of Tolkien criticism, unquote. So, but before Janet takes the mic, I have a list here of small housekeeping details. So I'd like to ask everyone to put all the cell phones on the silence to limit the disruptions of Janet's talk. And Janet's presentation will be followed by Q&A, so please hold the questions until the end of the presentation. As you see, this event is being video recorded by RUTV for their At the Podium series and will be broadcast and made publicly available on the internet. If you decide to make a comment or questions, please make sure and understand that will be included in the broadcast. We'd like to extend our gratitude to our colleagues of the Office of Summer and Winter Sessions, Dominic House and Liz Beasley. The Office of Winter and Summer Sessions are actually arranging for this event and providing 10 copies, free copies, which will be, I guess, distributed or raffled.
I think they're having a raffle
at the end of the event. We're also very grateful to the Barnes & Noble for being on hand to sell copies of Janet's book. And lastly, if you enjoy this presentation and are interested in other events at the libraries, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So now, please join me in welcoming Janet Brennan Croft.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much. Okay. Well, it's a truism of both popular and serious critical response to Tolkien's best-known works that there are no women in them, or no women worth speaking of, or, okay, maybe there are a few, but they aren't important, or, okay, maybe they might be important, but they're stereotypes of queens and warriors and country bumpkins, and they're not portrayed like real women at all. So obviously Tolkien didn't like or care about women all that much, and Peter Jackson had to add female characters just to make his films marketable to women viewers, and that's all there is to be said in the matter. But since the earliest scholarship on The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, there's also been a strain of criticism that has sought to remedy such claims, that insists that Tolkien's fiction does have something useful and modern to say about women and femininity, and that his women do enact essential rather than merely supportive roles, and even that the women in his life were more interesting and important than previously realized. Let me tell you a little bit about my own personal experience as a reader of Tolkien. I first encountered The Hobbit when I was 7, and The Lord of the Rings when I was 11. The Silmarillion came out when I was in high school, and Unfinished Tales when I was in college. The lack of women in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings didn't bother me much. Years later, when I read Melanie A. Rawls' essay, The Feminine Principle in Tolkien, which is included in the book, I realized it was because I found the aspects of the feminine that were embodied in the best of his male characters compelling enough to keep me reading, even if I didn't see my exact mirror image anywhere in the books. And I had enough female heroes elsewhere in my own childhood reading, which, when I look back at them now, seem close kin to some of Tolkien's heroines. Princess Eilonwy in Lloyd Alexander's Prydain books, as brave as Éowyn. Sarah Crewe, who in A Little Princess could weave words nearly as well as Luthien wove songs. Adventurous girls like Lucy Pevensey and Jill Pole of Lewis's Narnia books. Smart and loving girls like Meg Murray in A Wrinkle in Time. Quick-thinking and self-sufficient girls like Ava Lada in the unjustly forgotten Bill Bergson books by Astrid Lindgren. There was no lack of role models. But other readers did pay more attention to Tolkien's female characters, or lack of them. While this hasn't been a particular focus of my own scholarship on Tolkien, as editor of the journal Mythlore and of several books on Tolkien, I've had a lot of experience with a particularly disturbing phenomenon, ignorance of earlier scholarship on the topic. A prime motivation for me in developing this book with my co-editor Leslie Donovan was my frustration with getting submission after submission to Mythlore from people either saying that Tolkien was anti-feminist and ignored women, or reinventing the wheel and covering the same ground as some classic article dating back decades. As someone who cares about the direction of Tolkien scholarship, I wanted to see new critics building on this strong scholarly foundation, having a dialogue with earlier work, and not just rehashing tired old critical cliches. Leslie and I are both members of the Mythopoeic Society, a group founded in 1969 to study the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and other fantasy authors. Since 2006, I've edited the Society's refereed scholarly journal, Mythlore, and there's some free copies there if you want to pick up any of them on your way out. And I'm currently the Society chair, and I'm gearing up for our upcoming conference, which starts next Thursday. Which I'm presenting 2 papers, I'm doing this, I'm judging the Clare Hughes. It's a madhouse those couple of days. But anyway, Leslie is the editor in charge of the Society's press, which usually publishes about a title a year on average. Most of our books have been reprints or first publications of rare items from our primary authors and their associates, but we also do essay collections. My own Tolkien on Film was the first of these back in 2004. We've also published Past Watchful Dragons, Fantasy and Faith in the Worlds of C.S. Lewis, The Intersection of Fantasy and Native America, from H.P. Lovecraft to Leslie Marmon Silko, and since Perilous and Fair came out, Baptism of Fire, The Birth of the Modern British Fantastic in World War I, and I do have a couple of copies of that one here. So, the first stirrings of feminist and female-centered criticism of Tolkien appear as early as 1971, when Doris T. Myers published Brave New World, The Status of Women According to Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams in the Cimarron Review. As indicated by the article's title, philosophies arising from the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s led not only to increased interest in marginalized fiction, like Tolkien's fantasy fiction, but also to new scrutiny of those works from feminist perspectives. Readers and critics of the late 20th and early 21st centuries sometimes interpreted Tolkien's Middle-earth narratives as lacking in women, preserving cultural stereotypes of female roles, and reflecting anti-feminist tendencies. Laura Mitchell sums up such discussions when she writes that, for years, Tolkien has been criticized, attacked, explained, forgiven, and mainly misunderstood when it comes to the matter of women. Criticism on this topic has ranged from mild attempts to excuse Tolkien's point of view to truly violent accusations of misogyny and chauvinism. Yet, at the same time, other researchers began producing original, detailed scholarship that recognized more positive context for Tolkien's female characters and argued for a more nuanced understanding of Middle-earth women. Although many of these scholars agreed that the historical context of Tolkien's life prevents him from being considered a feminist of any sort, radical or otherwise, discussions were published that interpreted Tolkien's women as imbued with unconventional power, particularly those in The Lord of the Rings. Where other works of modern fantasy or mythopoeic literature offer traditional presentations of female characters, scholars in the 21st century have noted increasingly that Tolkien's women are constructed to highlight less common and more positive positions of power. Now, despite such positive attention to the subject of women in Tolkien's world, other recent works echo views from earlier periods of Tolkien scholarship. For instance, Blackwell's Companion to J.R.R. Tolkien, which was published in 2014, shortly before this collection, and intended to serve as an essential resource for Tolkien specialists and students alike, includes a chapter titled Women that insists that enforced female passivity is present in all three of the main female characters of The Lord of the Rings. That perspectives like this continued to be published by well-respected presses after so much research effort and printer's ink has gone towards correcting this observation is troubling. One motivation for this collection arises from our observation that this Blackwell chapter is not an isolated example, but reflects an alarming tendency, even among current Tolkien scholars, to be unfamiliar with the more positive readings of Tolkien's female characters and gender politics to be found both in classic and current research. So, Perilous and Fair aims in part to remedy perceptions among scholars and readers that Tolkien's work is bereft of female characters, colored by anti-feminist tendencies, and has yielded little serious academic work on women's issues. The 14 articles collected in the book were selected for their use of diverse forms of evidence to examine the relevance of women to Tolkien's works, life, and literary sources. Especially central to these articles is a consistent recognition that, although Tolkien's fiction undeniably contains many more male than female characters, women enact essential rather than merely supportive roles in Middle-earth and in his life. Now, as we reflect in our collection's title, Tolkien's female characters generally are fair in ways identical to those of earlier fantasy heroines. They're beautiful, unblemished, courteous, kind. Nevertheless, Tolkien made it clear that many of his women are also perilous in ways previous literary works had attributed primarily to women who were villainous or otherwise allied with evil. To cite two obvious examples, Éowyn is a shield maiden, a warrior trained to wield a sword in her own hand and destined to slay the undefeatable Witch King of Angmar. And Luthien not only rescues Beren from Sauron's prison, but she uses her magic to help Beren wrest the Silmaril from the Iron Crown of Morgoth himself. Now, while such characters frequently require the aid of male heroes, it is significant that the male heroes equally require the power of these women to achieve their victories. Unifying the concepts of perilous and fair lends our collection not only its title, but also a metaphor for issues of female power that's examined throughout the articles. Now, there are very few unambiguously villainous female characters in Tolkien's work. Maybe Shelob. We do regret that Tolkien's posthumously published poem fragment, The Fall of Arthur, came out too late for us to get any contributions considering his Guinevere. He described her as fair and fell as fey woman in the world walking for the woe of men. I think there's going to be a lot to be said about her in the future. We also did not have the room in this collection or the scope to look specifically at women in the Peter Jackson film adaptations. There are a few essays on women in the Lord of the Rings films in my 2004 collection, Tolkien on Film, but there's a lot waiting to be written about Tauriel in the recent Hobbit films. You don't agree. I think she's interesting, but yes, yeah, there's definitely contentious. Yeah. Okay, well, the 14 articles that we selected include 7 classic articles that were first published in several different sources between 1984 and 2007. These, we feel, represent strong readings that are textually sound and have made substantial contributions to the evolution of scholarship on women in Tolkien's fiction. These classic explorations are balanced by 7 articles published here for the first time, which offer original examinations that build appropriately on past articles and point the way to future directions for the topic. Since many more fine articles might have been included here, and we had to turn down a lot, this collection is best considered only as a representative sample of articles on the subject. We restricted our offerings to studies exclusively of Tolkien's life and works, not media adaptations, and we sought to avoid publishing works that substantially overlapped with each other in subject material or approach. So the collection opens with a section on sources in critical and historical contexts that consists of 3 new articles. The first is The History of Scholarship on Female Characters in J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, a Feminist Bibliography, which is an extremely useful and long-needed bibliographic essay by Robin Ann Reed that establishes the critical context for the study of women in Tolkien's life and works, analyzing trends and defending a feminist approach to the topic. This essay clarifies that significant scholarship has been published over the course of the field of Tolkien studies that addresses the subject of women, a trickle before the year 2000 and a flood since then. Because of the very thorough coverage of this article, we decided that a separate bibliography of additional reading was not needed. Robin is a professor of literature and languages at Texas A&M University of Commerce, and for the past several years she's been working on a really interesting digital humanities project, which is called the Tolkien Corpus. She's entering in all the text and doing all kinds of very, very cool mining of what she's finding there. So, following Robin's article is a study by John Ratliff titled The Missing Women, J.R.R. Tolkien's lifelong support for women's higher education, that explores the ways in which Tolkien's female family members, students, and colleagues informed his views on women as well as his writing. Ratliff examined several obvious and often overlooked instances of strong women in Tolkien's life in order to highlight his commitment to higher education for women as proof that he understood and empathized with women's concerns. Now, while we've had some good biographical studies that address the important women in his personal life, his mother Mabel, his wife Edith, Aunt Jane, and daughter Priscilla, the women in his professional life have been comparatively neglected before now. But as Tolkien himself said in response to Edwin Muir, an early critic who called The Lord of the Rings a boy's story lacking maturity, he says it's written by a man who never reached puberty and knows nothing about women except as a schoolboy. I thought it was very rude from a man who, so far as I know, is childless, writing about a man surrounded by women, wife, daughter, grandchildren, and we might add colleagues and students as well. Well, Edwin Muir, well, yeah, if anyone is familiar with Tolkien criticism, the Edwin Muir article is one of those that everybody points to and says, well, boy, he got that wrong. Okay. Sharon Schroeder's She Who Must Not Be Ignored, Gender and Genre in The Lord of the Rings and the Victorian Boys book, concludes this section by identifying relationships between Tolkien's novel and works such as H. Rider Haggard's She, the sort of thing that Muir said that Tolkien was drawing on. But they were the adventure romances that Tolkien enjoyed as a young reader, and they had a demonstrable effect on his own writing style and his themes. So through close comparisons of Galadriel and Ayesha, as well as genre differences and expectations, Schroeder corrects some central misconceptions about the portrayal of women and gender relations in The Lord of the Rings. In the section titled Issues of Power, we present 3 classic articles that serve as a foundation for the development of scholarship on women in Tolkien's fiction. The Feminine Principle in Tolkien by Melanie A. Rawls, which I mentioned earlier, explores the interaction of masculine and feminine principles, gender as opposed to sex, in Tolkien's Middle-earth. In this essential study for refuting claims that Tolkien rejects the feminine, Rawls demonstrates how the balance of principles within a character, for example, Galadriel's balance of power and self-knowledge, or Aragorn's combination of military might and healing ability, or more humbly, the Hobbit appreciation of cooking skills in both sexes, is an important factor in his or her place in the struggle of good and evil, evil resulting in many cases from an imbalance of these principles within a character. Expanding the conversation to incorporate larger issues of gender, Nancy Enright's Tolkien's Females and the Defining of Power describes Tolkien's female characters as offering a critique of traditional and worldly power typically embodied in masculine images. Her article establishes Tolkien's female characters as a reflection of biblical teachings that promote the choice of love over pride as a more powerful alternative to the domination by force that is typically conceived of as masculine. Enright reads Éowyn's rejection of the warrior life in favor of becoming a healer as a triumph of the power of love, not a diminishment of her character. Edith Crow's Power in Arda, Sources, Uses, and Misuses asks how one can be a feminist and still like Tolkien. She analyzes issues of power and renunciation in Tolkien's work, with particular attention to models of power relations based on dichotomies such as dominator versus partnership and power within versus power over, drawing on a framework developed by Rain Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade. Particularly important is Crow's consideration of various sources of power, spiritual, political, physical, and how these are wielded by various peoples and individuals in Middle-earth. As she points out, creative, life-affirming, and nurturing powers are those associated with good in Middle-earth and are found in both male and female characters. Now, the section on studies of individual characters deals with specific women, primarily in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, through 2 classic and 2 new articles. The Fall and Repentance of Galadriel by Romuald Ian Lukowski uses material related to the development of Tolkien's legendarium to examine Galadriel's depiction in The Lord of the Rings. Focusing particularly on Tolkien's evolving views on Galadriel's rebellion and redemption, Lukowski argues that Tolkien's continuing efforts to rethink Galadriel's place in his mythology until the very end of his life indicates the importance of this female character in his work. Cami Egan's new article, Luthien to Nuviel and Bodily Desire in the Lay of Luthien, positions and emphasizes the role of the female body as the primary source for Luthien's power in Tolkien's legendarium. For Egan, Luthien's feminine attributes, grounded specifically in her gendered body, portray her as an active, potent force in Middle-earth's history, in contrast to the passively ineffectual maiden other scholars have perceived when looking at her. Now, this article is particularly interesting for its examination of a highly positive depiction of female sexual desire and fulfillment in Tolkien's works. While Christine Larson also deals with a female character from Tolkien's legendarium, her article, which is also newly published here, describes the development of the Vala Nienna from her earliest versions as a one-dimensional goddess of doom to a complex and central figure of Middle-earth's mythology. In The Power of Pity and Tears, the evolution of Nienna in the legendarium, Larson contradicts views that Nienna's only mode is to weep passively for others by arguing that Tolkien eventually empowered this character with conceptions of mercy and mourning as participatory actions, echoing those in which Christian faith perceives the Virgin Mary as interacting with humanity. Chris is another particularly interesting scholar. She's working primarily in the area of inklings and science, particularly astronomy and cosmology, and she just gave the scholar keynote address at the 2nd annual New York Tolkien Society, which Anthony and Jessica hosted earlier this month in New York. So closing out this section is Melissa Smith's At Home and Abroad, Éowyn's twofold figuring as war bride in The Lord of the Rings, which shows how viewing Éowyn's relationships with Aragorn and Faramir in comparison with historical war brides provides striking insights about the character's psychology. In her attraction to Aragorn, she exhibits characteristics of the left-behind war bride, but as Faramir's wife-to-be, she is the war bride who leaves her home and family for a foreign land. Now, what's particularly interesting about all the articles in this section is how Tolkien's ideas about and depictions of these female characters evolved over the course of his writing. Even Éowyn, who did not occupy his mind for nearly as many years as Galadriel, Nienna, or Luthien, changed greatly during the period that he worked on Lord of the Rings. She started out she was designated she was going to be Aragorn's bride, but as he continued revising and working and figuring out his plot and everything, she developed into what we saw later on, the one who fell in love with Aragorn but couldn't have him, because the union of Aragorn and Arwen of the elf and the human lines was very important and had appeared elsewhere in Tolkien's mythology, and then he brought that into Lord of the Rings. So anyway, there was a change in that character, even though he only worked on Lord of the Rings for a short span of years compared to these others. I'm currently supervising a thesis on Luthien that is concentrating on just this aspect of her character, her change from the delicate little dancing fairy maid to a mature elf woman of powerful music-centered magic who's capable of defeating Sauron and Melkor, the biggest antagonist in Tolkien's world, and more than an equal to her male partner in both daring and self-sacrifice. So the question of why Tolkien kept returning to his key female characters and making them stronger, more interesting, and more fleshed out is an intriguing one, and it's a good direction for future research. Now, any study of Tolkien's works and life would be seriously flawed without some discussion of his sources in early literary history, which leads to the next section on medieval and Renaissance contexts. Here we offer my co-editor Leslie Donovan's The Valkyrie Reflex in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Galadriel, Shelob, Éowyn, and Arwen, to demonstrate how Tolkien's Old Norse sources suggest that female power may be expressed differently than male power. Donovan specifically traces the characteristics of the Valkyrie figure in medieval texts to present the ways in which Tolkien's characters exhibit, subvert, or transform the power attributed to these mythological women. Her inclusion of Shelob in this analysis is particularly insightful. Leslie is a professor at the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. Now, in contrast, Phoebe Catherine Linton explores Éowyn as modeled on medieval romance and quest conventions in her new article, Speech and Silence in the Lord of the Rings, Medieval Romance and the Transitions of Éowyn. Linton envisions Tolkien as using traditional patterns associated with medieval female knights to inspire his more modernly motivated war maid, drawing on sources like Christine de Bizan's tale of Joan of Arc and the 13th century French romance Silence. Bringing us forward into the Renaissance, Maureen Tomb's Hidden in Plain View, Strategizing Unconventionality in Shakespeare's and Tolkien's Portraits of Women, challenges us to look more closely at the disguises of women in The Lord of the Rings and Twelfth Night to discover alternative styles of power and gender. She compares Viola and Olivia to Éowyn and Galadriel. She urges readers to understand that both Tolkien and Shakespeare adapt traditional stereotypes of women in similar ways in order to advance gender roles beyond those normally limited by their societies. The final article in this collection stands by itself in its own category, Women as Readers of Tolkien, to point the way to future possible directions for the study of women not only within Tolkien's works and lives, but as these may inhabit other works. Una McCormick's Finding Ourselves in the Unmapped Lands, Women's Reparative Readings of The Lord of the Rings, demonstrates the way in which some women write fan fiction as a creative critical response to Tolkien's text. She draws on Junot Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, in which the title character finds himself in a problematic relationship with Tolkien's text, loving the book in spite of the absence of positive portrayals of people who look like him in it. McCormack investigates this representative sample of fan fiction that inserts new or previously marginalized female characters into Tolkien's familiar storyline to dialogue with the canonic text about issues of gender and power. So what directions might future scholarship on Tolkien's women take from here? Possibilities include close examinations of female characters in media adaptations of Tolkien's work, artwork, movie, television, games. Games would be interesting as well. What do such adapters draw from Tolkien, and what aspects of his works do they omit or alter? What do adaptations have to say about their creators' own readings of Tolkien? The tools of digital humanities also offer intriguing new ways to study Tolkien's text at a granular level, revealing gendered patterns of vocabulary and frequency of speech, for example, and enabling evidence-based comparisons with other authors. We might keep in mind these words from Robin Reed's opening survey of the field. The essays newly published here may act as guides to future scholarship in which the consideration of Tolkien's female characters and their intersections with feminisms will not seem so perilous in the growing body of work on Tolkien's legendarium and its reception. More broadly, Tolkien's works have come a long way from marginalization to near acceptance, and I say near as part of the canon. One welcome trend I'm seeing is the dropping of the previously nearly obligatory introductory apology for studying Tolkien that prefaces so many fine works of scholarship. We no longer need to make these excuses as, From one direction, the lasting value and merit of genre fiction and media are more widely acknowledged, while from the other, popular culture becomes more of an acceptable topic for critical and theoretical study. Tolkien sits at the sweet spot in the center of these converging trends. Our central aim in Perilous and Fair was to refute simplistic claims that Tolkien has nothing useful, relevant, or modern to say about women. We also intended to confirm that critics have engaged fruitfully with issues surrounding the feminine and female power since the early days of Tolkien scholarship, and that they continue to do so. We hope this body of work will spark further discussion and criticism about the roles of women in Tolkien's work and lives, and establish clearly the continuing importance of this topic to future scholarship. Thank you. All right, questions, comments? Yes?
Do you find, because you already said that there wasn't enough time with this volume to look at Jackson's adaptation.
Right, it's
This sort of
pretty
like-
thick already.
like
Yeah.
a twofold comment.
Yeah.
Are you considering doing a follow-up volume to this to sort of include some of these things that you just mentioned, like looking forward, other possible?
Well, we have kicked around in the society the idea of revisiting Tolkien on film. You know, Tolkien on film too, looking at The Hobbit, but also looking at further thoughts on the Lord of the Rings movies. You know, the first volume was pretty good. We got some good stuff in it, but there's been a lot.
The Hobbit.
Yeah, especially The Hobbit, because yes, Tauriel, love her or hate her, she's interesting. Why did he put her in? Why did he feel he needed to add this character? How far does she depart from what we think of as Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth? What purpose does she serve? She actually does something very interesting. She points out that isolationism is not a good thing, and she pushes that. But then in the third movie, she pulls back, and it's all romance and all that. So
The other question is,
yeah.
that there's some level that it almost seems to me that looking at the scope of what Jackson's done, there are some things that he's kind of undermined what Tolkien has done with women. And that was sort of like, especially with Eowyn, he's sort of like undercutting.
Yes.
You have these very rounded characters of Tolkien, you know, very, like you said, very important female characters, and in some way Jackson is pulling them back.
Yes, he is. I mean, he's making it look good. He's saying, he's making them all, giving Arwen a sword and everything. But then he has Eowyn do this thing where she tries to cook.
Right.
She can't do it.
And she
Yeah.
kind of gets made fun of.
Right. Well, why should she be cooking? She's a shield maiden. She's yeah. But anyway, yeah. But yeah, Jackson seems to he kind of undermines his own building up. So I think there's some interesting stuff that can be said about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, for me, like the Silmarillion, that's where like a lot of the really cool stories are. A lot of interesting characters, and I noticed one way you're talking a little bit about Arendelle, the sister Torvin, who had the relationship. She left Dunfermline, and she had the relationship with Evelyn Smith, and it ended up really bad. And,
Yeah.
And to me, like it almost he went further out on that road of developing characters in terms of like these kind of contrasting really role models that I've ever seen before. But it's a very short story.
Yeah, it doesn't flesh that out a great deal. Yeah, but when you look at the Silmarillion, there's some very interesting stories in there that are not what you'd expect if you just read Lord of the Rings. And you're not going to find they're all shield maidens and elf queens and everything. You find these other characters. You find these much more problematic relationships and so on. There's a paper that I'm really trying to get somebody to submit to Mythlore, but they're still working on it. But it's on consent in the Silmarillion. Partly, the women characters, whether they consent to the relationships that they're in and so on, but sometimes the male characters as well is being enchanted, is that kind of thing something that's done without consent. So yeah.
Like with Aurello, right? She's actually attracted to this other character, and he doesn't usually. Tolkien doesn't make that clear. It's more kind of like a fate kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is just it's sex, and it doesn't end up that well. Or even like Turin J.R.R., you know, where ends up with his sister.
Yeah.
And that becomes also a very tragic situation.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting because that goes way back to his earliest interest in Kalervo and the Kalevala and all the tragic mythic stories in there, and he kind of gets away from that later in his career. So yeah, but he never abandoned the Turin J.R.R. story. He just kept coming back to that and picking at it for his entire life. So yeah, yep. So yeah, there's a lot more work to be done. A lot of interesting little things to dig into. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was fascinating, this sort of analysis. I think Christine Larson, the power dynamics of the characters. I thought that was very fascinating because I think feminist scholars now are very interested in this sort of how power relates to different groups.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, this is very speculative, and I certainly am not very familiar with Tolkien, but do you think this volume actually focuses on women and also the gender dynamics in it? Do you see the possibility of a future volume that would say focus on diversity issues? Because do you think that's something that could be contemplated in a future work? Because
That could be interesting. Tolkien is viewed as rather problematic on diversity, and it's it's hard to say because a lot of people look at his orcs and say, oh, they are stereotypical other, they're portrayed as darker skinned, or they're orientalized or something. But he's also drawing on medieval sources for that. He's drawing on this kind of fairy tale opposition of dark and light. So what was he really doing with that, and what did he really believe? When you look at things in his letters, he's very widely tolerant in his letters, very accepting of people. Let's say for the most part, I'm trying to think of a couple of different examples. There was that well-known letter that a German publisher wrote to him right before World War II, I guess it was, and said, well, "Can we publish your books in German?" Oh, yeah, that could be interesting. Well, you'll have to have a certificate proving your Aryan ancestry, and he just no, forget that. Race is a problematic thing in Tolkien, and I haven't seen a really good, balanced study of that yet. And I'm not sure I'm not sure how well one could do a balanced study, because he was part of his time as well, and he fought in World War I, and he fought in his children fought in World War II. So he's got that whole thing influencing his picture of the world. So, yeah. Yeah.
Just have a question. You mentioned Shelob, and doesn't that go farther back? Is Ungoliant also female? And so it's sort of really interesting, the non-humanoid female characterizations. And I'm curious if the article that involves Shelob talks a little bit about Ungoliant and that lineage of dark.
Yeah. I don't think Leslie went back to that in her article. That's something to look at. But I think one of the ones it might be the Melanie Rawls article that talks about the balance of male and female principles, and the characters of Ungoliant and Shelob are like pure feminine principle, darkness, absorbing, hunger, appetite. Whereas characters like Morgoth and Sauron are the pure masculine principle, the controlling, the hard, cold, powerful. So you can see what Tolkien is setting up here is that if you fall down too far on either side, it's bad. You have to have that balance of the masculine and feminine principles in order to be a good, well-rounded character, human being or otherwise. So yeah, I think that it's undoubtedly in the index here that which one it was in, but I do believe Ungoliant is mentioned in a couple of places. Yeah, she's got a line and a half of index citations here.
If you would join me one last time in thanking Jen.